Hi and welcome to Lecture 7. In this lecture we'll talk about Ruby gems in general and a specific Ruby gem called Httparty. So Ruby gems is basically a package manager. You could look it up on the website called rubygems.org. There are really hundreds and thousands of different third-party Ruby gems out there. And gem is just a package manager that comes installed with a Ruby installation, and you could do things like do gem install certain gem. Now if you want to see if a gem is already installed, you could do gem list, and in this case Httparty, and you're going to see that that gem is not yet installed. So at that point you could do gem install Httparty. You could also specify -v with a particular version if you want, or you could just get the latest one if you don't specify the version. And it's going to go out to that rubygems.org website and grab a gem for you. Now you could also see more details about a gem by providing the -d option, and in this case it tells you who the authors are, what the license is, and most importantly what the gem does. And it says that it makes HTTP fun, okay, whatever that means. Also makes consuming RESTful web services dead easy. So let's concentrate on this sentence over here. RESTful web services dead easy. So what are RESTful web services altogether? So RESTful web services are basically your web services that are implemented using HTTP and the principles of REST, which means that they have a base URI, they support a data exchange format like XML or JSON, and possibly others, and they support a set of HTTP operations like GET and POST. And basically the idea behind this, without going too much into what REST is and how it works, is that we're flipping the whole idea of the web on its head. Instead of thinking of a web in general as a bunch of HTML pages, think of it as more in line to the MVC pattern we've been discussing. A website is really something that just stores some resources, and then when you go to the website, you could get those resources in any one of formats. Maybe you'll get it back as HTML, maybe you'll get it back as JSON, maybe you'll get it back as XML, and there are basically different formats representing the same thing. Now, some formats are easier to parse than others. For example, HTML is not so friendly to parse, but XML and JSON are. So, okay, so that means I have to now learn a whole new format like JSON or XML and actually write a parser for it in Ruby. Well, no, so that's where Httparty comes in. Httparty is the RESTful web services client. So think your browser. Right? Your browser is essentially a client of a website, of a different server, and most of the time you see HTML pages inside your browser. So your browser requests something from the server gives it back to him, and the browser displays the information inside the browser, and usually that's HTML. But again, that's hard to parse. So if you actually want to use that data, if you're doing a machine-to-machine communication, for example, right? So you want to maybe request some information via a Rails application from a different server, you would rather have that as a format that's easily to parse and not just easily to display. So that's where Httparty comes in. Httparty provides automatic parsing of JSON and XML into your Ruby hashes or arrays. So as long as the format that's coming back from somewhere is a valid JSON, a valid XML, Httparty has a very easy time parsing that into your Ruby structures, and then you could just use it. It also provides support for things like authentication, as well as default request query parameters. And web services are really out there pretty much everywhere. Every self-respecting website usually has a web service that it provides in addition to the HTML pages that it provides. But again, we're flipping the whole idea of web services on its head of web on its head and saying that really HTML that you see in a browser is just one of the formats. But a format could be JSON, it could be XML, it could be anything else. So how do you actually use the Httparty? Well, it's actually pretty simple. You include the Httparty module, and at that point, you're ready to go. And then you can specify the base URI for your requests, because the base URI is going to be pretty much the same across many different requests. You could specify default params. So, for example, let's say in your class you're going to have many different types of requests, but all of them are going to have an API developer key, for example, if that's what the web service provider requires you to put in. So you could just specify that as a default parameter that applies to all of your requests. And then you could also specify, you should specify the format to tell which format the data is coming in. And what do you know? Coursera itself has a RESTful API that it exposes. So you could go on the Coursera website and search for courses, and you see that information in HTML, which is how Coursera would prefer to display its courses. But Coursera will also give you raw information via a JSON format, but you yourself could figure out how to display or what to do with. This over here is the URL that describes in detail how the Coursera's RESTful API works. So before even jumping into how this works in Httparty, a lot of times it's useful to see how it works in the browser. So this would be your base URI, and then these are your request parameters which return back JSON. And as you could see here, JSON actually is very nicely formatted, and you could even like collapse it and expand it, which is really nice. So this particular behavior you could get by installing a JSON View browser plugin, and this is actually available for both Chrome and Firefox, possibly other browsers out there. And so again, basically it's a base URI which has some request parameters. In this particular case, if you don't specify any extra fields, you'll get a certain subset of fields. But in this case, I also want to get the small icon as a field coming back from Coursera, and a short description of a course which are not available as the actual subset of fields, but I want those extra fields in there as well. You also specify a queue request parameter. Yeah, and by the way, I should also mention that whenever you specify multiple request parameters, so the first one you just specify after a question mark, and any additional ones, if you're doing it in your browser, you specify with this this ampersand symbol. So the second parameter that Coursera expects if you are searching for something on its website is going to be this q equals search. And then a third parameter, if you're searching, it also wants the query parameter with the actual value of what are you looking for? What kind of courses are you looking for? Once you put this in, you'll get back this JSON, and I'm not going to go into the exact format of what a JSON format looks like because, again, Httparty is going to take care of it for us. We're actually parsing it into its native Ruby format of hashes and arrays. But in this case, as you could see, it's basically something that comes back that has an elements key, right? So it's going to be a hash, a Ruby hash that's going to have an elements key. And under that elements key, there's going to be an array of different elements. So this is course 1 that came back, course 2, and each one of those courses in turn is going to have its own, it's going to be represented as its own hash. So in this case, the hash is going to be with key ID and a value, and then key and a value, and so on. So all of these guys become your keys, and these are the values. So let's actually see a full example of how you do this in Httparty. Again, it's very simple. You have to require the Httparty because this is not a gem that's part of Ruby. You installed it, and anything that's not part of Ruby, you actually have to require with a require statement. Not only that, even things which are part of Ruby, like for example with PP, which is pretty print, it's part of Ruby, but it's not used so often. So you also have to require it by saying require PP. Okay, so this is our Coursera class. We include the Httparty module. And now we specify, again, based on what we got, based on what we figured out, based on this URL that we put into a browser, our base URI is going to be this. Then our default params, assuming that we actually want to always get back all of these fields for all the requests, we would specify fields request parameter, which is comma separated. In this case, it's just small icon, comma, short description. And we also want to tell it that we're going to be searching the website, the Coursera website, the Coursera web service. So we specify Q request parameter of search. Okay, so that's our default params. And lastly, we want to tell Httparty that the stuff we're getting back from Coursera is actually a JSON format as opposed to XML. So this class happens to have just one method, and that's fine, but you could have multiple methods, and if you would have multiple methods, these 3 lines would apply to all of those methods: the base URI, default params, and a format. So in this case, we have a class method called for, which takes in a term for what we're looking for. So in this case, it would be Ruby that we're using here. And then we make a GET request. So GET is something that Httparty provides you with. It's a method. And we're not really passing anything else. That's pretty much it. The base URI and the default params is all we need. And then as a second parameter, we pass in more request parameters. So more request parameters in this case are going to be the query request parameters. It's a little confusing. So the query key here is Httparty key, but the query here is this key over here that we provided as a last request parameter, query equals Ruby. So we're telling Httparty that there's a bunch of more request parameters, in this case just one, which we passed in as a hash, and the only one we actually passed in is this query parameter, which is going to be the value of term, which is a parameter we pass into the method. Now, once we get this back, we're going to get back a big hash, which is going to have elements as its key, as you could see from the previous page. And to pull stuff out of a hash, we're going to use the elements, the index elements, and that's just a typical Ruby way to pull stuff out of a hash. And as you could see, the actual values of a hash are is an array of Ruby elements. So that's what we would get back for the for method. So to test this out, maybe we could do Coursera, which is the class name, .for, because it's a class method. So we're not actually instantiating the Coursera class, we're just calling a for class method and passing a parameter, let's say Python. So what this would bring back is it would bring back an array where each element in the array would be a hash, and each element in that, each pair in that hash would be the key value of, let's say, ID, short name, with its value, and so on. So this is how you use Httparty to parse, to request stuff from a web service, and parse it into a hash and arrays, into your native Ruby structures, and then that's how it ends up coming back. So in summary, Httparty makes it extremely easy to ingest RESTful web services, convert them to Ruby hashes or arrays, whatever the appropriate structure is, and the JSON and XML formats are supported. So what's next? Next, we'll talk about bundler, because right now we know how to develop a Rails web application. We also know how to use Httparty, but how do you actually put a gem, a third-party gem, into your Rails application? And actually, how do all those other gems inside the Rails application already, how do their dependencies get synced up?